Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our seventh Chifley conversation for 2022. I'm David Epstein from the Chifley Research Centre, and I'm joined tonight by Anthony Forsyth from RMIT and Caterina Cinanni. I'd like to begin, first of all, with an acknowledgement of country. The office of the Chifley Research Centre is located on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I'm speaking to you tonight from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, as does Anthony. And Caterina is joining us from Gadigal country in the land of the Eora Nation. We'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from where we're speaking from and those of the lands on which you're joining us from tonight. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Our conversation tonight starts with Anthony's book, The Future of Unions and Worker Representation, the Digital Picket Line. And I'd like to welcome both Anthony and Caterina to the Chifley conversation tonight and thank them for joining us. Anthony is, of course, a distinguished professor in the Graduate School of Business and Law at RMIT University, and he's president of the Australian Labour Law Association. He's the author of multiple publications, and his research interests focus on collective bargaining, trade unions, union education, labour hire, and the gig economy. In 2015 and 16, he chaired the Victorian Government's independent inquiry into labour hire and insecure work. He's also the co-author of the 6th edition of Crichton and Stewart's Labour Law textbook, which is, I can remember from my own law school days, a pretty central textbook, and a co-editor of Collective Bargaining under the Fair Work Act. Our conversation tonight, as I said, is going to begin by discussing his latest book, The Future of Unions and Worker Representation, the Digital Picket Line, which was published only last month. It studies labour relations over the last 4 decades in 4 countries, Australia, Italy, the United Kingdom and the US, concentrating on the impact of neoliberalism and how various labour movements have responded to it. Caterina will be known to many of you. She's currently Director of Member Power for the United Workers Union, spending most of her days, I believe these days, out in the field or in the training room, organising, educating and leading campaigns. She can offer a perspective on these things at the coalface, as it were. She joined the inaugural ACTU Organising Works program in 1994 and spent almost 10 years as a growth organiser, building union membership and union power in non-union sectors for the former NUW. In 2005, she joined the ACTU Organising Centre as a campaign organiser and worked on organising national campaigns across a range of white and blue collar unions and was very much part of the Your Rights at Work campaign rollout. 2007, she returned to the NUW to help build a new national delegate and organiser development program, which was centred very much on building growth and activism. And in 2016, she followed that by being campaign director for the meat and agriculture sectors, where she led campaigns that unionised and built power amongst migrant workers working in non-union sectors that were dominated by contract and cash labour and visa exploitation. So she's very well qualified to comment on some of the practical challenges for unions in today's economy and some of the things that Anthony's identified in his book. And I want to begin the discussion tonight by asking both of our guests about what Anthony has to say in his book. Anthony naturally first. Anthony has been looking closely at the successes and failures of union movements in the 4 countries he studied over the 4 decades, particularly by contrasting Australian, UK and US organised labour with its Italian counterparts. On my reading of it, he's concluded that we need to rebuild collectivism, but he's warning that that's unlikely to be enough. And as a lawyer, and indeed as the person who read his forward said, you would expect him to say that legal reforms are required to restore the balance a bit more so that workers can be better protected. All of that said, Anthony does seem optimistic enough to believe that the that union revitalisation can be achieved. So, Anthony, I'll throw it to you now. You tell me what you actually had to say as opposed to what I think you had to say.
Sure. Thanks very much, David, and thank you to the Chifley Research Centre for the opportunity to talk about the book. And thanks a lot, Caterina, for joining us to enrich the discussion. And David, I did enjoy reminiscing with you briefly about our time together as Labor staffers in the first year of the Howard government. Not a great time for Labor or unions, but an interesting period for sure. So yeah, why did I write the book? I guess so much has been written about union decline in the last 30 years. And instead, I wanted to explore what unions are doing about this. How are they innovating to connect with young people, precarious and migrant workers? And that's really the first major focus of the book. And the second, you mentioned labour law. I guess because unions, including here in Australia, have invested quite heavily in campaigns to have centre-left governments enact favourable legislation, I wanted to interrogate, what is the importance or the role of labour law reform in strategies for union revival? As you mentioned, I did choose 4 countries to compare, 3 of them, Australia, the UK and the US, because there are very similar factors at play that have contributed to union decline, including the neoliberal attack on workers and unions from employers and the state, and also in each of those 3 countries, quite weak labour law support for unionisation. And also because unions in these 3 countries have adopted quite similar strategies to rebuild collective power, including predominantly strategic organising from the early 1990s. Both the UK and Australia borrowed from the US organising model. But adoption of that model hasn't led to a reversal of membership losses in the time since then. Now, I also looked at Italy because their unions haven't suffered the extent of declining power that we've seen in many other countries. There's still over 30% of Italian workers in unions, compared with 14% here and only 10% in the US. Collective agreements cover about 80% of the Italian workforce, compared with 30% here. And this sort of reflects the accepted position of the 3 major union confederations in Italy's National Social Partnership model, which I guess is quite a world away from the Morrison government's disparagement of unions here, as we saw in the Sydney trains dispute a few weeks ago. So that's why I chose to look at these 3 countries, just a snapshot of what I found out. I guess moving from the premise that really the problems facing unions can't simply be fixed by changing labour laws, I argue that unions in all 4 countries can regain influence. They probably won't regain the levels of 50 or 60% membership density in the post-war heyday, but they can regain some influence and power by committing to experimenting with new technologies, by forming alliances with other social movements, and also by being less rigid about what membership looks like or who counts as a member. And there is a lot of this already happening, and the book looks at many examples of innovative approaches to unionism here and overseas. One significant example in Australia in the last few years has been from Caterina's union, Hospo Voice. So, marketed as a digital union for young staff in cafes and restaurants, Hospo Voice has been very effective in exposing systemic wage theft at major businesses like the restaurants run by the celebrity chefs, and really giving workers tools through an app to empower them to fight back and get a taste of what collectivism looks like. It's less clear that Hospo Voice has significantly increased union membership in hospitality yet. And if we look overseas, you have, for example, in the US, the Fight for $15 campaign, which has been going for over a decade now. It's a US-wide movement driven by the Service Employees International Union, really to ratchet up pressure on big employers like McDonald's and Walmart to increase the minimum wage. We've got to remember, looking at the US from Australia, the minimum wage there is still $7.25 an hour at the federal level. And so this campaign through direct action tactics like walkouts and sit-ins and protests, and leveraging the media and especially social media, has put pressure on these big employers, and around 30 million US workers have obtained increases to $15 an hour through this movement. And it's been done in alliance with faith groups, with those campaigning for racial justice. So this is social movement unionism of a kind that has worked in achieving a significant outcome in terms of improving the lives of those workers. There is some skepticism among scholars and activists like US union organizer Jane McAlevey about just how sustainable these more campaign-based forms of unionism are. She's called the Fight for 15 a mostly publicity social media campaign that's created the illusion of a huge movement, because not that many workers have actually joined unions as a result of it. And a lot of others have questioned the longevity of digital unions, arguing that they drain union resources at the expense of traditional organising. I found examples of newer campaign-oriented unions that have developed into what we would consider to be durable membership-based organisations. There's a few examples of these in Italy. The grassroots unions there, C Cobus and ADL Cobus, which have been really effective in contesting shocking exploitation of predominantly migrant workers in the warehouses in central and northern Italy, using their ability to disrupt the supply chain to obtain improvements in working conditions. And this is a more combative form of unionism that we've seen some elements of in Australia in recent years, but perhaps not as much, obviously, as in the past. And in the UK, there are counterparts like Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain and United Voices of the World that have disrupted and turned around outsourcing, for example, in some of the NHS trusts to ensure that, again, marginalised, vulnerable workers like cleaners and security guards have obtained direct employment and therefore an improvement in the wages and conditions. So these and other examples show that the major successes of unions recently have been in some of the most challenging, what we labour lawyers call fissured work contexts, where work has been disintegrated through outsourcing and franchising and now the gig economy. And it's being done through independent member-led unions that are more prepared to take a confrontational position to meet the demands of marginalised workers. So that all deals with the first major focus of the book. I'm not going to talk as long about the second, which is the issue around, what is the role of labour law? But just briefly to comment on that, I am a bit critical of the ACTU's Change the Rules campaign in the lead up to the last election. I think unions here have at times placed too much store in the capacity of a political and legislative strategy to fix their problems. 2019 was not the moment that we saw in 2007 in relation to work choices and the Your Rights at Work campaign. I think there was some counting on a repetition of that occurring, but the circumstances were very different and the argument was very different. It was really a technical one about the problems with labour laws that, after all, Labor had enacted itself. So it was complicated. But having said that, I do think that, and I argue in the book, that the problems in our legislation that Change the Rules highlighted and the need to fix them are imperative. And so there are fundamental weaknesses in the labour laws of the US, the UK, and Australia that need to be addressed, and including by looking at some possibilities from Italian law to give unions and workers a fair chance of building collective power. We need to move from enterprise bargaining to multi-employer bargaining with the right to strike backing it up. And we've got to bring gig workers within employment and labour law protections. I can talk about that a bit more later on. So in summary, I argue that to win workers over, unions have to supplement organising. That project must continue, but supplemented by innovations, using technology as a bridge to build the connections between workers from which collective action grows. And I think COVID has presented unions with a major opportunity to do just that. In the wake of the pandemic, when for many workers just turning up for work became a life-threatening proposition, workers need unions now more than ever. So, David, that's 277 pages in a nutshell. So I'll leave it there, and I think it's over to Caterina in a moment.
Yeah. Well, Anthony, thanks very much. Very eloquently put, and you got to the points. You also said some things that are somewhat provocative, depending on what your perspective is. Caterina, I'm just wondering what you'd have to say in response to all of that. There's been some ticks and crosses.
Yeah, definitely. I was writing some of it down. I actually, thought I'd start my kind of intro with saying that I think chapter 5 in Anthony's book is like my entire life, both in terms of my parents' displacement from manufacturing jobs through sort of like some of the neoliberalism policies, into like the journey through organising works and the rejuvenation of the organising framework, all the way into the decline of the union. So I was going to say that was chapter 5, but actually everything Anthony just spoke about is probably, I'm probably going to go a little bit further in terms of being very confronting and challenging about like the challenges that the union movement faces and what we have failed to do through my lived experiences of 2 decades of organising workers in the movement. So I'll try to explore some of that in my intro, and then happy to take questions after that, David. But I think it's really interesting because I come from the first inaugural program, which was about grappling with the idea of bringing young women in, migrants in, and opening the union movement up, and finding more inclusive spaces to include workers who are not in unions at the time in Australia. And it's interesting that 2 decades after, we're still grappling with this issue of decline and revitalisation. We haven't actually been able to solve it. So I think it's good that Anthony's book has actually started to think about some of the solutions and some of the things that are working. I think we're very bad at actually looking and analysing at the lessons worldwide. And I would counter, I think the United Workers of the World is a great example. I think there are examples outside of the US, even though I'm a beneficiary of the US organising style. I actually think we've been very narrow in Australia about what rebuilding the union movement looks like. There's some great examples in Italy that I've been connected with Fly, which do agricultural work campaigning with migrants and undocumented workers, who have done some amazing organising of people outside of the economic and legal system of the country. So I think it's really important that we go very broad when we look at examples of union rebuilding. I think also a lot of the Southeast Asian countries that where unions and the democratic components of the union movement actually fight both political, military and government oppression have some amazing lessons that we could learn as a movement about how to rebuild through collective action in very hostile circumstances. So I think that that's a really important feature of the book. I think if I think through some of the themes that really jump out for me, and I talk about this a lot even with our delegates and organisers and any of the work that I do in the union, I think we often blame a lot of the external factors for the decline of the union movement in terms of the shift of the workforce, the shift in the political and the social landscape. But actually there's a really awesome quote that I always use, which came out of a body of research with delegates, where they, that when you ask workers who are in a union, what matters more? Is it what the boss does, or is it what the union fails to do? Workers will always say it doesn't matter what the boss does, it matters what the union did or didn't do at that point. And I actually think that there's a real lesson in that around the decline of the union movement. And I think in the foreword for the book, because even though I had COVID last week and I have not actually read the book, I have actually tried to read some of it on the plane today. There is a bit, I think, in the book which says that unless unions revitalise successfully, the labour movement is doomed. And I actually think that is almost equivalent to the quote that I use, that it's actually in our control as a union movement to respond to the challenges, and the way in which we respond actually will shape what we do. And I think also chapter 1 has got a little bit of, it's got a bit of a framework for our options. We could either become marginalised, we could duplicate, we can become replaced, or we can revitalise. I actually think they're not just 4 options. I actually think the union movement in Australia, all of those happen parallel to each other right now. We actually often think of ourselves as an organisation whose purpose is to win politically, when in fact we need to organise workers to win politically, or we use the digital to replace the worker organisation, and we become more of an activist-based movement rather than one that's actually about building worker power. So I thought that that analysis was a really interesting one of looking through the frame of options, but I think we have those options every day, and sometimes we get very confused in our purpose and we don't ground ourselves in the idea of building power. I think that probably the bit I disagree with is that you need to leave the old and find the new. I actually think, and I don't necessarily think the book actually says that, or the frameworks that you're using says it, but I do think that there's actually real merit in how we used to organise in really difficult circumstances. And I'm talking about where there was it's not unusual. The unions were born and forged from very hostile circumstances. The hostility has changed and it's shifted, but actually there are some really good lessons in old organising, but it needs to be combined with new methods and tactics and tools. And I don't think it's one versus the other. I think it's actually a combination of both. And my experience in organising farm workers has been that it's actually both of those things that have built success. So I got a message today to say we have now reached a milestone in our farm organising. We're over 5,000 members strong in an area where it's contracted cash, seasonal workers, undocumented. When we started campaigning 7 years ago, we had 20 members. So we can grow, and we can grow in a very methodical way in places that the union movement has not succeeded to grow, with very difficult, hostile, virtually non-union terrain and hostility from employers, legislation that doesn't support union organisation, workforce that is totally removed from society, especially the undocumented workers, and from community and from the economic frameworks that we all benefit from. And we've been able to succeed because we've used old and new in the way we've organised. So I think that would be like one of the things that really jumped out at me around our purpose. And I think that probably in that confusion, I did a talk recently with the SEIU, the nurses in Pennsylvania, about like some of the challenges that our movement faces in Australia, and I kind of probably put it down to 4 key things: confusion of purpose being one. We've also kind of almost made organising and the collectivism of workers a production, like a production line. We've tailorised it. We've kind of made it bespoke in terms of it's all about signing people up, and you have scripts and you have kind of very mechanical ways of doing it. And we've forgotten that you actually have to organise the whole person, the whole workforce, the whole community they live in. That it's actually not as simple as saying, you do this one magic formula and this thing will come out the other end. It's much more complicated because we're dealing with people's lives and circumstances, and you have to vary your approach and be very genuine. So I think the union movement has tailored itself too much and been too narrow rather than very broad in the tools that it uses. There's a real fear and risk. I think that's a real change in my 2 decades of like the legal environment has impacted in a way where it's made unions risk averse and afraid of consequences, as opposed to building hope and aspiration in workers that they can do things, including breaking the law if needed, to support their organising rights. And I think that's a really interesting space that probably needs a bit more exploration, because I think that is the space where the union movement's kind of lost a little bit of hope that you can actually have workers take risks and win. And I've stood with workers over the last few years where they have taken substantial risks and won, despite all of the circumstances. And like on a piece of paper, you would be told you shouldn't actually do any of the things that those workers did in order to organise collectively. So I think they're kind of the lessons that and the notes I jotted down on the plane as I glanced through the first chapter and the book.
Well, look, thanks very much for that, Caterina. That, I've got to say, preempted a lot of questions I would have had wanting to draw out, but I was interested by your concept of pulling together the old and the new, as it were. And as you were talking, I was thinking, it is perhaps the issue that unions, as they became more successful and as they became more institutional, and now suddenly we're in an era where a lot of the institutional framework that they had helped put in place, to make their effectiveness better, has suddenly been stripped away, but they've remained institutional, as it were, and dependent on the framework that no longer exists. So, you talk about a bit about going back to the old, where, of course, people were literally fighting for the right to organise, and to even exist as organisations. So we're perhaps not quite back to those ages, but we're probably closer to it than we were in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you... Oh, sorry.
But what I was wondering is, we're closer to it, but we're in what appears to be a more atomised society than might have existed when unions were first getting off and running, albeit without a framework. So they could lean on tighter knit, smaller communities. They could lean on the sorts of institutions that older communities used to sustain with a less atomised population. Modern unions perhaps can't do that. So where do we go to relearn the old, as it were? Do we go back to the history books? Do we go to the United States, or we've been relying too much on the United States because I'm thinking of guest workers in the United States? Or should we be looking more to places like Italy? Should we be looking more to issues like the huge population flows that have occurred across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe?
Yeah,
I invite either of you to respond to those.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about the old and the new, which has come up a bit already, I'm not for a minute advocating only for the new. I mean, the whole concept of the digital picket line, which is the subtitle of the book, really symbolises what I'm trying to say here, which is unions have to draw on the best of the past. So we do have to go back to the history books, David, in some ways, because what we're talking about doing is exactly what people who started unions in Industrial Revolution Britain were doing. We are trying to refashion that very rich tradition of collectivism for a modern, as you said, atomised, deregulated, restructured modern economy where, businesses and employers have been very adept at hollowing out even what the concept of the employer looks like, splintering work off into different business units that they are not responsible for maintaining minimum employment standards or observing them. So distancing themselves from that, but also distancing themselves from ever having to talk to a union or another collective representative on behalf of a group of workers. So I think it's about saying, well, how do we reignite that spirit of collectivism that enabled unions to be founded and to flourish. And in Australia, they did that within the context of a very supportive institutional framework in conciliation and arbitration for about 100 years. But that day is over, and our legal supports have been whittled away, and it hasn't helped, but it's not the total story. So it's sort of saying, well, you know, how do you use digital tools to present to a young worker who has no real understanding probably of what a union is or what it could do for them, and has grown up in a very individualistic mindset and generation, because that's how society has become. There's been a lot of detachment from collectivism. How do we imagine what we're presenting that worker with as a proposition to entertain becoming a union member? And I mentioned Hospo Voice, the idea of a union being an app that you pay $10 a month to sign up to get access to tools that help you combat exploitation or sexual harassment. That's one way. A group of game developers have formed Game Workers Unite, and now they're partnering with Professionals Australia to bring industrial representation for a group of workers that are mostly contractors and work a hell of a lot of overtime, and a lot of it's unpaid. The AWU is doing it, or trying to do it, with hairstylists. So these are the ways, I think, in which some unions are stepping up. But yeah, it's definitely a balance of the old tools that have worked, but using technology and new forms of unionism to present workers with a fresh idea of what a union looks like and what it can do for them.
Yeah, and I think I agree. Yeah, I was going to say, when Anthony talks like that, I often do like the analogy of the fishing net. Like the digital tools are like you know, for some parts of what we do is like a fishing net. You're putting out into the universe what it means to be union, and trying to capture the workers who have issues that you don't have access to in the ways that we could traditionally do it, right? And then when you've got them in, then you need to give them the collective experience. And I think that's the bit that we still don't quite have right in the way in which we're organising. I loved that Digital Picket Line story in the book, though, because it actually did two things. Because I think that's the other part, is that you can actually take collective action in a digital sense and take it in a physical sense as well. And I think that's a really great example of how you use the old and the new together. And we did it recently. We had an action with workers at the Country Road warehouse where they were fighting for secure work. Over half of that warehouse is labour hire agency workers spun in and out with no job security, but there is actually a pool of people who could have secure work. And organising the permanence is quite easy. Organising workers who the next day are no longer there is very difficult. And even though we did a lot of effort in doing that, it actually was really, really hard to keep a sustainable level of members, where the theory would say you must have the majority in order to take action. Whereas in fact, we took action with a minority of workers. But what we then did was tactically employ a range of things to put leverage on the company to win secure work. And we won, you know, that warehouse has gone from 40% permanent work to now 60%, and won a 13% wage increase as low paid workers over 3 years. One of the things that happened halfway through it was we targeted Fashion Week, and we used our digital activists from Hospo Voice to actually come in on and almost invade Fashion Week with the employer corporate responsibility spokesperson, talking about corporate responsibility in their supply chain while they had striking workers at Truganina. And those Hospo Voice workers went in and did a magnificent job of actually taking over that event and making it a PR disaster for Country Road. That, combined with a couple of other old school tactics, actually won the dispute, but it couldn't have happened without those permanent workers taking the action in the first place. And it couldn't have happened had we not had Hospo Voice bringing in a bunch of young people who were amazing activists and showed solidarity on an issue with workers who would normally never be together necessarily anywhere. You know, like those Hospo Voice workers would be working in inner city restaurants, and our Truganina warehouse workers are in the western suburbs, right? But we brought them together, and that's rebuilding a union through collective action. But we did it both with old measures and with new. So I actually just think we need to stop saying it's one versus the other, and it's just both. It's not organising versus servicing. You do both. It's not digital versus old school. You do both, and you do it with the purpose of building collective power.
Fair enough. I'd like to invite some more audience questions if I can, and those people who want to pose questions, if you can just post them on the Q&A function rather than in the chat. We'll pick up some questions from the chat, but we'll leave the chat for chatting, and if future questions, if we can just get in the Q&A. I'll just touch on what you were just saying there, Caterina, and just ask both of you about this. What you seem to be describing is a combination of communications and commonality of interest. And commonality of interest is something that interests me in regard to your own union, pardon the pun, because unlike some of the other amalgamations, you do seem to have a bit more, you're less diverse in terms of your potential membership pool. You know, there are more common interests there. So clearly there's a bit of that. But in campaigns like the one you've just described, or campaigns, you know, around wage theft, particularly in the hospitality industry, there's been a lot of communication, and that's depended on being able to shame people, good PR, and enlisting third parties, you know, whether they be activists or the media. But how sustainable is that when the conversation moves on? And you might argue, for example, that the conversation has moved on a bit on wage theft and the hospitality sector because there's no longer the big personalities to attach some of the poor behaviour to. You know, how do we deal with that?
Yeah,
interested in both your responses on this.
I might go first because it might set up what Caterina could respond with in relation to the particular example. But I mentioned Jane McAlevey, who's run incredible organising campaigns under the broken American labour law system for educators and for healthcare workers. She's a strong believer that organising is still possible, even in one of the harshest union busting environments in the world. But I mentioned her critique of the Fight for 15, and there are quite a few others who have questioned the sustainability of campaign-based unionism. And one of them's a labour law scholar, Catherine Fisk, who sort of says exactly as you just did, David. These campaigns gain a lot of attention. But, what happens after that campaign ends? What happens after you get the wage increase at the McDonald's store in Arkansas or wherever it is, and the movement moves on to another state or locality? And Fisk says that if you're really going to build enduring worker power, you have to have some kind of institutionalisation. And I think established unions, I think, have to have a go, like UWU has done with Hospo Voice, at incubating these new digital forms of unionism and see where they lead, see whether after a few years, and we're now about 4 or 5 years into the Hospo Voice project, whether enough hospitality workers have seen the benefit of that collective action, the fighting back against wage theft, that I've said they've done quite effectively. So they move from the sort of lower level of affiliation through the app, which is the entry point that's been created that a lot of unions don't have. It's still full fee membership or nothing. But do they move on from that to become full members? Now, my impression is that that hasn't happened to a huge extent with Hospo Voice members. And there is another step in the story which came after the close off for the publication of the book, which was around May last year, which was soon after that. The Hospo Voice leadership moved from, so originally it was $10 to get access to the app, and we'll give you these tools to help you win at work. But they then moved to a tiered approach. So different membership levels ranging from basic to standard to plus, with the extent of services that you would get based on the fees that you were willing to pay. Now, they faced then a revolt from the rank and file, from the group of workers who had been very instrumental in becoming activists and driving the initial project, basically saying this isn't the form of unionism we signed up for. This is service unionism. We're activists. We've been winning the way we've been going. Now I'm not an insider in this story. I'm an interested outside observer who's tweeted a bit about it from time to time. But my understanding is that there may have been some deficiencies in how that very significant change was explained and presented to the existing members. But I think what it shows is that, good on Caterina's union for trying this. But I do think they are incredibly costly experiments. The technology for the app and the things surrounding it costs the union a lot of money. And so at some point, these digital experiments, and there are other examples overseas, they have to evolve into a dues-paying organisation. And I think that's what the Hospo Voice leadership was trying to do with that.
Yeah, I think it raises, like, without going too much into the machinations of like Hospo Voice, maybe if I just pull out some of the themes from it. But I think that is right, Anthony, like there's a transition, and that's what was trying to be done behind the scenes. But I think it actually, like, there's probably a couple of points that I just wrote down. One is, firstly, I actually have read Jane McAlevy's books, and I do like the premise that organising works and is still something that is successful in terms of revitalising the union is very much what I support, and that's been my lived experience. So I think, that kind of comes back to the challenges that I spoke about in the intro, is that I think there's been a loss of hope that we can win and rebuild. But actually there are so many success stories, and we keep missing them and not using them. And I think the Starbucks campaign that is happening in the US is a great example of a small workplace and one part of a very major company organising, like 30 workers organising, and somehow lighting a fire for a whole range of other Starbucks and small workplaces, that it is possible to win an agreement. And I think there's almost like perverse lessons in that for the movement. We keep saying we have to go after thousands of workers, when in fact you could organise a small workplace and build hope and win and use that to inspire. And I think that sometimes we keep getting that lesson wrong in the movement. So I think that's a little bit of what Jane talks about as well. I think there's a tension in the digital space, and in like the Fight for 15 is a great example, is the tension between using a whole bunch of new tactics to build campaign and leverage to win something versus building power and using those tactics with workers, and leaving a union behind. The union isn't an institution, it's the members. If we haven't left behind members in that workplace, leaders, structure for workers where they own the entire win, then what we haven't built power. We've just won an outcome. And I think that's where David, you talked before about the union as an institution. I mean, we've actually kind of got to a point where we're really used to winning outcomes without having power. And there'll be a tipping point somewhere where we can't win anymore. We don't have influence. We don't have relevancy because we don't have power. And you can't have power if you don't organise workers to actually raise the issue, own it, take action on it, and build political consciousness, because that's how you build it, through the experience of collectivizing. So I think that's the fight for 15. That's the tension. There's a lot of amazing tactics. If you could deploy them where we're organising workers, then we're building a powerful union, right? Because then we've got both the organisation of workers with the campaign tactics. So I think that there's a confusion and a tension there. I think the union fee, the digital space union fee proposition that you kind of talked about with Hospo Voice, I think there's a lot of rhetoric around, and some of it comes in Australia from people who bought organising works here as well. Like a little bit of it comes from the history of the program I came from, that somehow organising doesn't work and the business model of unions is broken and we need a fundamentally new fee structure. I actually do not. I personally don't accept that, because we've organised farm workers who are undocumented, paid below the minimum wage on cash arrangements, and they pay the same fee as a worker who has an agreement. Like they're treated equally, and we ideologically treated them equally because we didn't want to create a different standard, because the employer creates a different standard every day for these workers, and we didn't want to have a union that did the same. And those workers, because they own that campaign, they are fully immersed in the outcome and the win. The union fee is not an issue. And I think sometimes the union fee is an issue for us. We feel uncomfortable asking low-paid workers to pay a fee, but workers will do it if they think there is value and they are part of the union, and that it's not just some transactional service. So I think sometimes that's where the digital space often gets confused, and then that transition becomes really difficult. I know a lot of those activists that were part of who were a bit disenfranchised in that journey. They actually would all agree that they want a fighting union, a union that can fight. We just haven't done the work of transitioning that with their buy-in and their ownership of it. So I think it's as simple as a communication issue, but I do think it's reflective of a broader issue in the union movement. And I'm talking outside of the United Workers Union. I think there's this raging debate about how we structure ourselves. I do think there needs to be multiple points of membership into the union. I worked on a community campaign with community membership with the Vic Market traders. They have, like, traders, who would think small business owners actually would join a union, but they joined our community membership because we stood in solidarity with them on an issue. There's lots of parts of our economy where there are people who would identify with the values that the union that we talk about, and in terms of having power and a say. We just are not very creative in it. And so a really good example, I was thinking about, like, what would be the legal reforms? We keep asking for actual industrial outcomes instead of rights. I remember talking to an education union about, why don't you do a log of claims with the parents? Teachers and parents putting a log of claim on the government together for the things they want in terms of education for their children and for the teachers, because they probably would align. Just because our system doesn't allow it doesn't mean you can't organise around it in a way that's really concrete. Like, that would be an example of, we need to open up rather than close in the way in which we talk about the union.
So it strikes me that you're saying that you should be selling yourselves as a cause or an organisation rather than simply a service provider or a software product. We're getting close to time, and we're also actually getting close to an election, which has thrown up a couple of questions. Kevin Hayes is asking, why don't governments, and I assume by reference to governments he means governments of all colours, embrace social contracts like previous governments used to do with business and labour. that we seem to be living in an age where corporations and bosses and the management class dictate what's supported by conservative governments rather than necessarily the people who might vote those governments in. What can be done? He's asking what can be done to rebuild those sorts of concepts of social contract, environmental contract, financial contract with governments of all persuasions.
Yeah,
have you got any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in. When I think social contract, I think of the Accord. Union, Labor government in partnership. In an era when there was still a pretty healthy dialogue between the representatives of workers and business. Business was not formally part of the Accord, but certainly played a role in it and some of its structures. If your rights at work was a moment in time, then I think the Accord was a previous moment in time. And I think so much has happened since then, whereby employers, business, and the coalition have demonised unions and made the notion of people joining unions into something toxic rather than something of value, that I just don't think it's not even from my point of view worth unions considering this. We do have a recent example of an attempt to do it. I think the initial response of unions, business and government to the pandemic was, some people were talking about the Accord revisited, because unions did immediately respond to the national health, economic and social crisis by agreeing to modify awards, to wage freezes, to curb their demands. Protected action for new agreements was pretty much dead for 6 to 12 months. Unions came up to the party or played their part in the national interest. Then Morrison gets everyone together to talk about IR reform coming out of that. And by the end of 2020, it's a business agenda for IR reform, and all the consensus has just been washed away. So and I argue this in the book, my sense is that unions have shown goodwill in Australia and in other countries, and employers and conservative side of politics only ever take advantage of that for their benefit. So I think the moment for accords and social compacts in the Australian context is over. It's time for unions and workers to claim their legitimate position as the representative of workers. And I think if Labor did happen to win this coming election, I'm hopeful but not yet confident, as I'm sure many of us are. I think everyone's being very quiet at the moment about IR reform. It's part of small target and don't really say anything that's going to frighten the horses. But I think it's incumbent on the union movement, if Labor does win, to push hard for stronger laws than we have at the moment.
Yeah. Caterina, just quickly on that point, have you got any suggestions about what sort of things we should be looking at were to be a Labor government?
Yeah, I have a lot. But I don't necessarily what I would say would reflect necessarily all the opinions in my own union. I think probably just a couple of things. I think we really are at a point in time where if we keep arguing that we need to have a government give workers rights in terms of industrial outcomes, wage increases, like whatever it might look like, ultimately what we're really doing is taking all the power away from working people to actually win it themselves. In fact, what we need is organisational rights. We need to protect our activists and delegates when they take on the fights that they need to have, because otherwise what we're doing is acting as the institution, and then we kind of sit there and wonder, when it's all pulled away, where did we go wrong? And we end up with no power at all. And I think I remember once asking Marshall Gantz a question, who, because he's like very much, lauded for like the Obama campaign and all the digital work. I remember asking him, why is it that unions fight so much to get like win political power, and then when we win power we stop fighting. And I remember him saying, and I was referring to the Obama election at the time, the second one, and I remember him saying that what happens is unions confuse access as power. So all of a sudden the doors open and we're in talking to government and ministers, and we think that access gives us power when it doesn't. Our power comes only from membership. It comes from a democratic relationship with a growing and vibrant and active membership that will keep the union movement and any government to account. That's the missing piece. So what Anthony says is like totally spot on. And I think, you know, I actually come from a migrant family that lost their jobs and were made redundant in the transitional workforce from a manufacturing country to a service-based country. But I also went to Melbourne Uni and did economics. And at the time, I thought the Accord was the most wonderful thing, but my lived experience in working in the union movement has made me really question like what it actually undid. And what it undid was the way you collectivise workers across sectors. Once upon a time, you would have solidarity between a nurse and a warehouse worker because they would fight together for their wages. Now it's so individualised, and now the atomisation has occurred. And what it's done is we didn't have a replacement for that. We actually took away the one collective element of fighting together for a national wage increase and put everyone into individualised arrangements. And that's a legacy that organisers like me have had to undo and face and battle with for the 20 years that I've worked in the movement. That decision made it really hard to organise workers. Not impossible, but it made it a lot harder. And I think we need to be careful that when we talk about these things, that we are not setting it up to fail 20 years down the track and make it even harder to build power for working people in this country. So I think that would be like, that's my reflection of politics, government, the union's role, but also let's not also have rose-coloured glasses about the Accord. There were many workers that lost out over the 2 decades after that, and we're still bearing the brunt of the consequences of that decision.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you both of you. It's been a fascinating conversation. It's a conversation indeed. I think we could go for hours tonight exploring, you know, where we might take things. You know, mindful of what you just said, Caterina, about the unintended consequences that come out of you know, some initiatives. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. This is, of course, budget week, so we've organised a special joint panel with the Shadow Minister for Finance, Senator Katie Gallagher, this coming Friday at 1 p.m, which people will have received notice of through our social media posts and through our newsletters. That's a joint panel organised, as I said, with Katie Gallagher, with other think tanks, including the McKell Institute, Per Capita, and John Curtin. Well worth attending. We'll post some details about that tonight as we close out, along with some details about Anthony's book and where you can get it. As we say, all good bookstores, but especially online, and there's a discount code for it because it's such a comprehensive book. And then next week, we will be exploring disinformation and conspiracy theories and organisations like QAnon, which have not only gained a foothold in North America, but gained a foothold here in Australia. And we'll be talking with the author and Guardian columnist Van Badham about that. So please look out for the details of that Chifley. But as I said, thank you very much to both of our panellists tonight. Thank you for joining us. See if you can join us this Friday at 1 p.m. for the joint panel discussion with Senator Katie Gallagher. And then next Wednesday night, we'll be having the discussion with Van Badham about what she describes as QAnon and anon and anon. Okay then, thank you and good night.